September 1943. The streets of Haarlem, Netherlands. A young girl pedals her bicycle through the afternoon shadows, her dark hair woven into two long braids that swing gently as she rides. She looks maybe 12 years old, innocent, harmless. The kind of girl you'd see carrying school books or running errands for her mother. Nazi soldiers stand at checkpoints along the route, their eyes scanning pedestrians and cyclists for anything suspicious. The girl with the braids approaches. They glance at her. They see a child. They wave her through, without a second thought. They don't check her wicker basket. That's the mistake that will cost some of them their lives. Hidden beneath a cloth in that basket, nestled among what might appear to be groceries or personal belongings, lies a handgun. And the girl with the braids knows exactly how to use it. Her name is Freddie Oversteegen, and she's 14 years old, but don't let that fool you. She's already a trained killer. She's part of the Dutch resistance, and she's arguably the most daring member of one of the war's most legendary trios of female fighters. This is the story of a girl who looked like she couldn't hurt a fly, but became the first of her group to kill a Nazi soldier, a teenager who used makeup and feminine charm to lure German officers to their deaths in the woods. A young woman who walked hand in hand with Jewish children through occupied streets, appearing for all the world like an innocent older sister, while actually smuggling them to safety. A resistance fighter who transported weapons, planted dynamite, and executed traitors with the same hands that would one day hold her own children. And yet, for most of her life, Freddie Oversteegen lived in shadow, overshadowed by her more famous sister. Overshadowed by their friend whose red hair made her a legend. Overshadowed by a society that didn't want to acknowledge what women had done in the war, and especially didn't want to acknowledge what communist women had done. Near the end of her 92 years, Freddie would say something that cut to the heart of her experience. Women don't count. They still don't. That hasn't changed. But her story matters. It matters because it's true. It matters because it happened. And it matters because understanding what people like Freddie did and what it cost them is the only way we can truly comprehend the reality of resistance during the Second World War. Let's go back to the beginning. September 6, 1925. Freddie Nenda Oversteegen was born in Schotten, a small village that would later become part of Haarlem in the province of North Holland. She wasn't born into privilege or comfort. Her family lived on a barge, one of those working-class canal boats that served as both home and sometimes livelihood. Her father, Jacob Oversteegen, didn't make much money. The family struggled constantly. There was an older sister, Truus, born 2 years earlier in 1923. The two girls would become inseparable, bound together by circumstance and later by the most intense experiences human beings can share. Their mother, Trishna van der Molen, called Trishna by those who knew her, was a woman of strong convictions. She was a communist, a believer in social justice, and someone who put her principles into action, even when it cost her. She and Jacob were both members of International Red Aid, a social service organization connected to the Communist International. These weren't just political beliefs written on paper. These were lived values. Even in the depths of their poverty, the Oversteegen family took in refugees. People fleeing persecution in Lithuania hid in the hold of their barge. The girls learned early that when someone needs help, you help them, regardless of the risk or inconvenience to yourself. The marriage between Jacob and Trian didn't last. As Freddie would later recall, her mother simply got fed up one day. Jacob never made any money. He couldn't pay for the barge. The situation was unsustainable. But the divorce wasn't bitter. Jacob loved his daughters. When the family left, he stood on the bow of the barge and sang them a farewell song in French. It was romantic and sad, and utterly impractical, which probably summed up Jacob Oversteegen pretty well. After the divorce, Freddie didn't see her father much. That absence would be one of many losses in a childhood that was defined by hardship. Trian moved with her two daughters to Haarlem proper, into a small apartment where the sisters shared a bunk bed. They slept on straw mattresses. The apartment was cramped and cold in winter. Money was always tight. But Traian worked hard to provide for her girls, and more importantly, she taught them. She taught them about justice and injustice, about standing up for what's right even when it's difficult, about the importance of fighting fascism. She enrolled them in the Dutch Youth Federation, a communist youth organization. The girls spent time making dolls for children caught up in the Spanish Civil War, learning that their actions, however small, could help people suffering far away. Traian later remarried and had a son, giving Freddie and Truus a half-brother they called Robbie. The family remained poor. There wasn't much to go around, but they had each other, and they had their principles. Those principles were about to be tested in ways no one could have imagined. The late 1930s brought ominous news from Germany. Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party had taken control. Jewish people were being persecuted, stripped of their rights, driven from their homes. Some fled west, seeking safety in the Netherlands, hoping the Dutch would remain neutral as they had in the First World War. Traian didn't hesitate. She opened her home to Jewish refugees from Germany and Amsterdam. A Jewish couple lived with the family for a time. It was through them that young Freddie first began to understand what was really happening under Nazi rule. The stories they told were horrifying. The systematic cruelty, the dehumanization, the growing danger. In 1939, when Freddie was just 13 years old and war had officially erupted across Europe with Germany's invasion of Poland, the Oversteegen household became a center of quiet resistance, even before the Netherlands was invaded. The family printed illegal anti-Nazi magazines right in their living room. The printing press was so loud they had to post lookouts to warn them if anyone was coming. Freddie and Truus would sneak out at night and daub resistance slogans on walls. "Don't go to Germany," they write. "For every Dutch man working in Germany, a German man will go to the front." They pasted their messages over German propaganda posters calling for Dutch workers. It was dangerous work. If they were caught, the consequences could be severe. But the girls were fast and clever, and at their age, authorities were less likely to suspect them. This was the world Freddie lived in when the Nazis came. May 10th, 1940, Germany launched a massive invasion of the Netherlands. The Dutch fought back, but they were overwhelmed. The country had tried to remain neutral, just as it had in the previous war, but neutrality meant nothing to Hitler. German planes bombed Rotterdam, killing hundreds of civilians and destroying the city center. It was a terror bombing designed to break Dutch will. It worked. 5 days later, the Dutch Royal Army surrendered. Queen Wilhelmina fled to London to form a government in exile. The Netherlands was occupied. The nightmare had begun. The Oversteegen family immediately burned all their radical literature. They had to protect the refugees still hiding with them. But the danger had multiplied exponentially. Being caught harboring Jews under Nazi occupation would mean death for everyone involved. The refugees had to be moved to other locations. It was a heartbreaking process. These were people the family had come to know, to care about. They all understood what was at stake. Many of those refugees were later discovered in their new hiding places. They were all deported. They were all murdered. Decades later, when Freddie talked about this, she would still be moved to tears. "We never heard from them again," she said. "It still moves me dreadfully whenever I talk about it." But Freddie and Truus couldn't just sit by and do nothing. They continued distributing illegal anti-Nazi newspapers and pamphlets. They kept posting their warning messages over German propaganda. They were only 14 and 16 years old, but they were committed to resistance, and their activities were about to attract some very important attention. His name was Frans van der Wiel, and he was the commander of the Haarlem Council of Resistance. He'd heard about these two young sisters who were fearlessly spreading anti-Nazi materials around the city. He decided to pay them a visit. One day in 1941, he knocked on the Oversteegen's door. He was quite formal, taking off his hat and shaking hands with both girls. He introduced himself. To Truce's embarrassment, he sat down in the lumpiest chair in their modest living room. Then their mother excused herself and left the girls alone with their guest. Franz got straight to the point. He was putting together a resistance group, not just people distributing pamphlets. He needed fighters. He needed people willing to commit acts of sabotage. He needed people willing to use weapons. The tasks he had in mind was subversive, violent, and extremely dangerous. He was asking 2 teenage girls if they were willing to risk their lives fighting Nazis, and he wanted their mother's permission to recruit them. Freddie and Truce looked at each other. This was it. This was the moment when resistance went from being about posters and pamphlets to being about life and death. Truce asked the question they were both thinking. Would they have to kill people? Franz didn't sugarcoat it. Yes, they would. But he emphasized that the targets would be carefully chosen. Gestapo officers, traitors, people who were actively hunting down Jews and resistance members and having them killed. Not just any German soldier. Real fascists, real criminals. The girls went to their mother for guidance. Trien's response would stay with them for the rest of their lives. She gave them her permission to join, but she gave them one rule, one principle they had to carry with them no matter what they did. Always stay human. Always remember your humanity. Never let the violence turn you into the monsters you're fighting. Hold on to your conscience. Hold on to your compassion. Never lose sight of why you're doing this. It was an impossible ask in some ways. How do you kill people and stay human? How do you watch people die by your hand and maintain your compassion? But it was the challenge Trine set before her daughters, and they accepted it. Freddie was 14 years old. Truce was 16. They officially joined the Council of Resistance. At first, Franz didn't tell them everything they'd be doing. He started them off with what seemed like straightforward sabotage work. They'd blow up bridges and railway lines to disrupt German military operations. We told him we'd like to do that. Truce recalled years later. Then Franz added the rest. And learned to shoot. To shoot Nazis. Freddie's response, according to her sister, was perfectly matter-of-fact. Well, that's something I've never done before. The training began. The girls were taken to an underground potato shed where they learned to handle firearms. They learned to shoot. They learned to throw grenades. They learned to plant explosives. They practiced until they were proficient. The resistance couldn't afford mistakes. When you're a teenager going up against the Nazi war machine, you don't get second chances. You either do it right or you die. So Freddie and Truce practiced. They learned. They prepared themselves for what was coming. Their first major operation wasn't an assassination. It was arson. The target was a Nazi-occupied warehouse. The method was clever and disturbing in its simplicity. Freddie and Truce dressed up, put on makeup, made themselves look pretty. Then they approached the SS guards at the warehouse and flirted with them. The guards, seeing 2 young, attractive girls paying attention to them, were completely distracted. While the guards were preoccupied, resistance members set the warehouse on fire. It burned. The mission was a success. 2 warehouses, actually, both destroyed. And the sisters learned something important. Their youth and their femininity were weapons. The Germans didn't see them as threats. That made them incredibly dangerous. But burning warehouses was one thing. What came next was something else entirely. What came next would haunt Freddie for the rest of her life. Her first kill. The moment when she stopped being a girl distributing pamphlets and became a killer. She was the first of the 3 famous female fighters to actually shoot someone. The first to cross that line that can never be uncrossed. The details of that first kill aren't entirely clear. What we know is this. Freddie shot a Nazi soldier while riding her bicycle. It might have been a planned assassination. It might have been an opportunistic attack. It might have been a drive-by style operation with Truce pedaling and Freddie shooting from the back. What we know for certain is that Freddie pulled the trigger. She watched a man fall. and something inside her broke in that moment, even as she knew it was necessary. Years later, when Freddie talked about killing, she always came back to the same thing, the physics of it. Not the feel of the trigger or the kick of the gun, but what happened after. "Yes, I've shot a gun myself and I've seen them fall," she said. "And what is inside us at such a moment? You want to help them get up." That instinct never left her. Every time she killed someone, her immediate impulse was to run to them and help them, to undo what she'd just done. It was her humanity asserting itself in the midst of horror. It was the thing her mother had asked her to hold on to, and it tortured her. But she kept doing it, because it had to be done, because these were people who were hunting and killing innocent civilians, because the alternative was to do nothing and watch the darkness spread. Freddie and Truce both justified it to themselves this way. They were killing collaborators who had betrayed their neighbors. They were killing foreign invaders who had no right to be in their country. They were soldiers, and soldiers do what must be done. When people asked them how many they'd killed, they always gave the same answer. You never ask a soldier how many people they've shot. The tactics evolved. The honey trap became one of their signature methods. Here's how it worked. Freddie or Truce, dressed nicely, wearing makeup, would enter a tavern or bar where German officers were drinking. They'd make eye contact, smile, start a conversation, flirt. The officer, flattered by the attention of a pretty young woman, would relax. Eventually, one of the girls would make a suggestion. "Want to go for a stroll in the woods?" The officer, thinking he was about to have a romantic encounter, would eagerly agree. They'd walk into the forest together. And then, in a secluded spot, one of two things would happen. Either the girl would pull out a gun and shoot him herself, or a male resistance fighter would appear, as if by coincidence, and do the killing while the girl made her escape. Sometimes they'd stage an argument. The male fighter would say something like, "Girl, you know you're not supposed to be here." They'd apologize, turn around, and walk away. As soon as they were out of sight, gunfire. The officer would fall. By the time his body was discovered, the resistance fighters were long gone. It was cold-blooded. It was calculated. It was murder, if you want to call it that, though the resistance called it liquidation. Freddie later described feeling a kind of dissociation during these operations. You had to shut off part of yourself to do it. You couldn't think about the fact that this man might have a family, might have children waiting for him to come home, might be somebody's son or brother or husband. You had to think of him as a symbol, as the enemy, as someone who was part of a machine that was murdering millions. Otherwise, you couldn't pull the trigger. But afterwards, in the quiet moments, in the dark of night, the humanity came flooding back. The sisters both struggled. They cried about it. They had nightmares. "We did not feel it suited us," Truce said later. "It never suits anybody, unless they are real criminals. One loses everything. It poisons the beautiful things in life." But they kept doing it. Again and again. They became some of the most effective assassins in the Dutch resistance. And then, in 1943, the trio became complete. A young woman named Janette Johanna Schaft, called Hannie by her friends, joined the resistance cell. Hannie was different from the Oversteegen sisters in some ways. She came from a more educated background. She'd been studying law at the University of Amsterdam, dreaming of becoming a human rights lawyer. She had close Jewish friends. When the Nazis ordered all students to sign a loyalty oath to Germany, Hannie refused. She quit university rather than compromise her principles. She wanted to fight back. She wanted to use weapons. She found her way to Frans van der Wiel and the Council of Resistance. Hannie had one very distinctive feature: bright red hair. It would later make her famous. The Nazis, not knowing her identity but having seen her at several attack sites, put her on their most wanted list as the girl with the red hair. Eventually, Hannie would dye her hair black and wear glasses to disguise herself, but that red hair became iconic. Even Adolf Hitler himself reportedly ordered her capture. The three women worked together beautifully. They had complementary skills and personalities. Hannie was the intellectual. She spoke fluent German, which made her valuable for infiltration. She was thoughtful and strategic. Truce was the leader. Decisive, pragmatic, down to earth. She made the tough calls and kept everyone focused. And Freddie was the planner. She would map out their missions in advance, think through the details, anticipate problems. She was also the most feminine and fierce, a combination that made her exceptionally effective at the honey trap operations. Together, they became a standalone unit within the larger resistance cell. They trusted each other completely. Their lives were literally in each other's hands every single day. They were the only women in a 7-person cell, and they proved that women could do everything men could do in combat operations, and sometimes do it better, because no one suspected them. Their work went far beyond assassination. They were involved in every aspect of resistance operations. Sabotage was a regular duty. They used dynamite to blow up bridges, cutting off German supply routes. They destroyed sections of railroad track between IJmuiden and Haarlem, disrupting troop movements and military logistics. These weren't small symbolic gestures. These were real tactical operations that materially impacted German military capabilities in the region. They also worked as messengers and couriers, transporting weapons and illegal documents hidden in their bicycle baskets. Freddie would pedal through the streets of Haarlem with firearms concealed under a cloth, right past German checkpoints. The soldiers would see a young girl with braids on a bicycle and wave her through. They never imagined that this child was carrying guns to resistance fighters or transporting forged identity papers that would save Jewish lives. Speaking of saving Jewish lives, this was perhaps the most important work they did. The three women helped smuggle Jewish children to safety. The operation was brilliantly simple. Freddie or Truce would walk hand in hand with a Jewish child through the streets, acting like an older sister taking a younger sibling on an errand. To any observer, they looked like a normal family scene. Who would question two sisters out for a walk? The girls would escort these children to safe houses or to contacts who could get them out of the country entirely. They saved dozens of children this way, maybe more. The exact number isn't known because so much of resistance work went unrecorded for security reasons. But the work wasn't without its terrifying moments. Sometimes they were caught in air raids while transporting children. Some of those children died in the bombings. Imagine the trauma of that. You're trying to save a child's life, and despite your best efforts, they're killed by bombs while in your care. The guilt of that would be crushing. But the women kept doing it, because for every child they lost, there were others they saved. And every saved life mattered. They worked in the emergency hospital in Enschede, on the German border in eastern Holland. This gave them cover for their activities, and also allowed them to gather intelligence on German military movements. They could observe a German military airport and report back to the resistance about troop strengths and activity patterns. They distributed illegal newspapers and anti-Nazi posters throughout the region. Every day brought new risks, new close calls, new chances to be caught. The psychological toll was immense. They witnessed horrors that no one should ever have to see, let alone teenagers. German and Dutch SS troops would randomly seize innocent people off the streets. Men, women, children. Line them up against walls and shoot them. Force their families to watch. Freddie and Truce saw this happen. They were forced to witness it, helpless to intervene. The rage and disgust they felt in those moments, the sheer hatred for what the Nazis represented, it fueled them. But it also scarred them deeply. Truce once witnessed something that pushed her beyond her breaking point. She saw a Dutch SS soldier snatch a baby from its father's arms and smash the infant against a wall, killing it instantly. The father and the baby's older sister had to watch. They were hysterical. Without a second thought, without waiting for orders, Without considering the consequences, Truce walked up to that SS soldier and shot him dead right there. It wasn't a planned liquidation. It wasn't an assignment. It was pure human reaction to inhuman cruelty. She shot him because someone had to, because letting him walk away after murdering a baby was unthinkable. These were the kinds of experiences that filled their days and nights. They lived in constant danger. The Germans were offering enormous rewards for the capture of resistance fighters. By the end of the war, 50,000 guilders was being offered for the capture of the Oversteegen sisters. That was a fortune. Anyone who betrayed them would be set for life. Yet somehow, they survived. They were careful. They were smart. They changed their appearances. They trusted almost no one. And they kept fighting. But the darkness was always there. The nightmares. The intrusive thoughts. The way violence becomes normalized when you live with it every day. They both suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. At night, they would scream in their sleep, fight invisible enemies, wake up in cold sweats. The trauma was accumulating. Truce would later spend time in a mental institution. Freddie would experience periods where she couldn't get out of bed for days at a time. But during the war, there was no time for processing trauma. You just kept going. You did what had to be done, and you hoped you'd survive long enough to deal with the psychological damage later. The three women, Freddie, Truce, and Hannie, grew incredibly close. They were more than friends. They were sisters in arms. They understood each other in ways no one else could. They'd seen things together that bound them forever. They'd saved each other's lives multiple times. They'd watched each other kill. They'd cried together. They'd laughed together in the brief moments when laughter was possible. They were a family forged in blood and fire. And then they lost one of their own. March 21st, 1945. Hannie Schaft was stopped at a military checkpoint in Haarlem. She was carrying illegal communist newspapers and a pistol concealed on her bicycle. It should have been a routine stop. She'd passed through countless checkpoints before, but this time something went wrong. Maybe the guard was more thorough than usual. Maybe someone had tipped them off. Maybe it was just bad luck. Whatever the reason, they searched her. They found the gun and the papers. Hannie was arrested. She was taken to prison in Amsterdam. The Gestapo knew they had someone important. They just didn't know who. They interrogated her. They tortured her. They kept her in solitary confinement. Hannie had dyed her black hair back to her natural red by this point, but they still didn't make the connection that she was the girl with the red hair. They'd been hunting for so long. Not at first. Then, tragically, a former colleague named Anna Leinhoff identified her by her red roots. Anna had been captured and was being used by the Nazis to identify resistance members. Whether she intended to betray Hannie or was coerced, we don't know. But once Hannie was identified, her fate was sealed. The resistance tried desperately to rescue her. Truce disguised herself as a German nurse and went to the prison with a fabricated story about needing to take Hannie for a medical examination. She cried, she pleaded, she was convincing, but it turned out Hannie had already been moved. The rescue attempt failed. The ambitions of the prisons are rather more sensitive. Hannie's parents were arrested and sent to Herzogenbusch concentration camp near Den Bosch, also known as Camp Vore. This was a deliberate strategy to break Hannie psychologically, to force her to give up information about her fellow resistance fighters. The distress of knowing her parents were suffering because of her, combined with grief over the recent death of another resistance friend, temporarily broke her spirit. Her parents were eventually released after 9 months of imprisonment, but Hannie never got the chance to see them free. By then, the war was in its final weeks. The Nazis were losing. Liberation was coming. But they still had time for one more murder. April 17, 1945. 2 Nazi officials, a Dutchman named Martin Kuiper and a German named Christopher Heinz Schmitz, were her executioners. According to later testimony, They shot her at close range. The first bullet, fired by Schmitz, didn't kill her. It grazed her, causing terrible pain. Hannie, even in her final moments, showed her courage. According to the story that became legend, she told her executioners, "I shoot better than you." Then Kuiper took out a submachine gun and fired a burst of bullets. One of them hit her in the head. Hannie Schaft, 24 years old, died in those dunes. Her body was buried right there, in a mass grave with hundreds of other resistance fighters. She wasn't discovered until after the liberation. 422 bodies of resistance members were eventually found in those dunes. 421 of them were men, and one girl with red hair. On November 27, 1945, Hannie was given a state funeral. Queen Wilhelmina herself attended. She called Hannie the symbol of the resistance. Hannie was reburied with full honors at the Dutch Honorary Cemetery in Bloemendaal, where she rests to this day. The location of her final moments is now marked by a memorial, one of several throughout the dunes, commemorating where the Nazis executed resistance fighters. For Freddie and Truus, losing Hannie was devastating. They'd been through so much together. They'd relied on each other completely. And now, Hannie was gone, murdered just weeks before liberation. The guilt was crushing. The sense of loss was unbearable. They'd survived, but their friend, the girl with the red hair who had fought so bravely beside them, hadn't. That survivor's guilt would haunt them for the rest of their lives. May 5, 1945. The Netherlands was finally liberated. The German forces in the country officially surrendered. The nightmare was over. Freddie was 19 years old. Truus was 21. They'd spent their entire adolescence at war. They'd killed more people than they could count. They'd saved lives. They'd witnessed horrors. They'd lost friends. And now, suddenly, it was over. What do you do with that? How do you go back to normal life after experiencing what they'd experienced? The answer is, you don't. Not really. You can't. The war had changed them permanently. Freddie later said that the war didn't really end for her until she died. That might sound like hyperbole, but it's the truth of trauma. You carry it with you forever. In the immediate aftermath, Freddie spent a few months healing at the Loo Palace. Queen Wilhelmina had opened the palace to veterans and resistance fighters for recovery. It was a gesture of gratitude, a recognition of what these people had sacrificed. But a few months in a palace couldn't undo years of psychological damage. After that, Freddie went to work for the Political Investigation Service. This was the agency responsible for tracking down and arresting Nazi collaborators. It seemed like a natural continuation of her resistance work. She was good at it. She arrested collaborators all over the country. But she started noticing something disturbing. The wealthy collaborators, the high-ranking ones, the ones with connections, they weren't being arrested. Only poor people faced consequences. When she reported this discrepancy, she was told to ignore it. Freddie resigned immediately. She couldn't stomach the hypocrisy. After everything she'd done, everything she'd sacrificed, to see justice applied selectively based on class, it was too much. She married an engineer named Jan Dekker. They had 3 children together. By all outward appearances, Freddie settled into a normal, quiet, domestic life. She focused on being a wife and mother. When people asked her later how she coped with the trauma of the war, her answer was simple. By getting married and having babies, creating life after being surrounded by death, building a family after losing so much. It was her way of moving forward, of trying to be normal, of trying to forget. But you can't forget. The memories don't fade. Every year on May 4th, which is Remembrance Day in the Netherlands, Freddie would wake up filled with dread. The anniversary of the liberation should have been a day of celebration, but for her it was a day when all the ghosts came back. She struggled with insomnia her entire life. Depression would hit her in waves. Sometimes she couldn't function. Her son Remy would later say that he believed the war never truly ended for his mother. She was fighting it in her head every day for the rest of her life. And there was another source of pain, one that had nothing to do with combat or killing. In the decades after the war, Freddie lived in the shadow of others. Hannie Schaft became a national icon. Schools were named after her, streets. There were books, a movie in 1981 called The Girl with the Red Hair. Hannie's story was taught to school children across the Netherlands. She was the symbol of female resistance. Truus also gained recognition. She married a fellow resistance fighter named Piet Menga in November 1945. She became an artist, a sculptor and painter, whose work was heavily influenced by the war. She wrote a memoir called Not Then, Not Now, Not Ever, published in 1982, about her resistance experiences. She spoke publicly, gave lectures at universities and secondary schools about war, anti-Semitism, tolerance, and indifference. She was honored as Righteous Among the Nations by Yad Vashem in 1967. She received the Order of Orange Nassau in 1998 on her 75th birthday. She founded the National Hannie Schaft Foundation to preserve her friend's memory. She was a public figure, respected and honored. And Freddie? Freddie lived quietly, raised her children, served on the board of the foundation her sister created, supporting Hannie's legacy. But she felt sidelined, overlooked. She admitted later that she was jealous of Truus. I have always been a little jealous of her because she got so much attention after the war, Freddie said in an interview. But then I just think I was in the resistance as well. Part of the problem was political. Freddie and Truus were communists. Their mother had raised them that way. They'd been members of communist youth organizations. They distributed communist newspapers during the war. And in the post-war period, with the Cold War beginning and anti-Soviet sentiment running high, the Dutch government didn't want to give too much credit to communists, even communists who had fought the Nazis, even communists who had saved lives and risked everything. When other resistance fighters were awarded pensions for their service, Freddie and Truus were initially refused. The government was soundly anti-Soviet. Orders came down, possibly from Queen Wilhelmina and Prince Bernhard themselves, to minimize recognition of left-wing resistance members. It wasn't until well into the 1960s, more than 20 years after the war ended, but the sisters finally received their resistance pensions. There was no back pay for those 2 decades. This was the bitter reality Freddie lived with. She'd been arguably the most daring of the 3 famous female fighters. She'd been the first to kill. She'd pulled off some of the most dangerous operations. She'd smuggled children, transported weapons, planted bombs, executed traitors. She'd done everything asked of her and more. And for most of her life, almost nobody knew about it. Almost nobody cared. Because she was a woman. Because she was a communist. Because the world prefers its heroes to be men, preferably men who fit comfortable narratives. Women don't count, Freddie said. They still don't. That hasn't changed. But in the final years of her life, something did change. In 2014, when Freddie was 88 years old and Truus was 90, they finally received proper recognition from their government. Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte personally awarded them the Mobilization Oorlogscruis, the Mobilization War Cross. This is a significant Dutch military honor, and it's usually awarded by mayors. For the Prime Minister himself to present it demonstrated how important the government now recognized their service to be. According to Freddie's son Remy, that ceremony was a highlight of his mother's life. After decades of feeling invisible, of living in shadow, she was finally being honored publicly for what she'd done. Streets in Haarlem were named after both sisters, not just after Hannie, but after Freddie and Truus too. Their names became part of the city's geography, ensuring future generations would remember them. In 2016, a Dutch television documentary titled Two Sisters in the Resistance told their story to a new audience. Freddie appeared in it, speaking about her experiences more openly than she ever had before. The documentary brought renewed attention to the sisters' contributions. International media began covering their story. They were finally getting the recognition they deserved, even if it came so late in life. But time was running short. Truce died in June 2016, at the age of 92. For Freddie, losing her sister was like losing a part of herself. They'd been through everything together. From their childhood on the barge to the war years to the long decades of post-war life. They'd understood each other in ways no one else could. According to Truce's daughter, one word was enough for them to understand each other. They had relied on each other completely during the war. Their lives were in each other's hands. That bond never broke, and now Truce was gone. Freddie had suffered several heart attacks in her later years. Her health was declining. She spent her final years in a nursing home in Driehaus, about 5 miles from Haarlem. On September 5, 2018, one day before her 93rd birthday, Freddie Oversteegen died. The last surviving member of the legendary trio was gone. The obituaries that followed her death told her story to the world. The Washington Post ran a lengthy piece that drew huge reaction. Major international news outlets covered her passing. People around the world learned about the girl with the braids who had killed Nazis from her bicycle, the teenager who had seduced German officers and led them to their deaths in the woods, the young woman who had walked hand in hand with Jewish children to safety, the resistance fighter who had planted bombs and smuggled weapons and executed traitors. But more than the individual acts of bravery, what struck people was the larger story. The story of how women's contributions to the war effort had been systematically minimized and ignored. How Freddie had spent most of her life in shadow despite her extraordinary courage. How even in death, it took international media attention to bring her story into full light. It was validation of what she'd said. Women don't count. They still don't. Looking back at Freddie Oversteegen's life, several things become clear. First, the sheer courage it took to do what she did. 14 years old when she joined the resistance. Still just a child, really. Most 14-year-olds today are worried about school and friends, and maybe sports or hobbies. Freddie was learning to kill human beings. She was transporting weapons past Nazi checkpoints. She was helping children escape genocide. The weight of that responsibility on such young shoulders is almost incomprehensible. Second, the psychological cost. Freddie paid for her courage with her mental health. The nightmares, the depression, the insomnia, the inability to escape the war, even decades after it ended. This is the reality of war that we often gloss over in stories of heroism. Heroes pay a price. The trauma doesn't end when the fighting stops. In some ways, that's when it really begins, because suddenly you have time to process what you've been through. Suddenly you have to figure out how to live with what you've done and what you've seen. Third, the injustice of her erasure. For most of her life, Freddie's story went untold. She lived quietly, privately, while others were celebrated. And it wasn't because she'd done less. If anything, she'd been more daring than most. But she was a woman. She was a communist. She didn't fit the narrative that post-war society wanted to tell about itself. So she was ignored. And that's wrong. It's a betrayal of everything she fought for. Fourth, the importance of her mother's lesson. Always stay human. Trine Oversteegen gave her daughters permission to fight, but with that one crucial condition. Don't become monsters. Don't let the violence strip away your humanity. And incredibly, impossibly, Freddie managed it. Even after all the killing, even after all the death, she maintained her conscience. That instinct to help the people she'd shot, to want to pick them up even as they fell, that was her humanity asserting itself. It cost her tremendously. It added to her trauma, but she never lost it. She remained human. She did what her mother asked. Finally, her story matters because it's a reminder that resistance takes many forms, that courage isn't always loud and public, that some of the bravest people who ever lived spent most of their lives unknown. That women have always been warriors, even when history tried to erase them. But the fight against fascism required ordinary people to do extraordinary things, and that we owe those people, especially the women, our memory, our recognition, our gratitude. Freddie Oversteegen didn't want to be a hero. She didn't want to kill anyone. She wanted to live a normal life. But when her country was invaded and her neighbors were being murdered, she made a choice. She chose to fight. And she fought with everything she had, with her youth, with her innocence, with her appearance, with her courage. She fought until liberation came, and then she spent the rest of her long life trying to reconcile what she'd done with who she wanted to be. She was right about one thing. Women still don't count, not the way they should. Women's contributions to history, especially military history, are still minimized and ignored. Women's stories are still treated as footnotes to the real history made by men. That needs to change, and the way we change it is by telling stories like Freddie's, by insisting that her life mattered, that her courage mattered, that what she did and what it cost her deserves to be remembered. September 5th, 2018. One day before what would have been her 93rd birthday, the girl who rode her bicycle through occupied Harlem with a gun in her basket, the teenager who seduced Nazis and led them into the woods, the young woman who walked Jewish children to safety, the resistance fighter who planted bombs and executed traitors, the soldier who never told anyone how many she killed, the survivor who spent her whole life haunted by what she'd seen and done, the mother who tried to heal by creating life after being surrounded by death, the woman who lived in shadow while others were celebrated. Freddie Oversteegen. She deserves to be remembered, not as a footnote, not as a supporting character in someone else's story, but as a hero in her own right, as someone who did what had to be done, as someone who paid the price for courage, as someone who never lost her humanity, even in the midst of inhuman circumstances, as someone whose story matters, as someone who counted, even when the world tried to say she didn't. Women don't count, she said. They still don't. But maybe, just maybe, by telling her story, by making sure people know what Freddie Oversteegen did and who she was, we can start to change that. We can start to count the women who counted. We can start to honor the courage that went unrecognized. We can start to give credit where credit is long overdue.